All right, welcome back to another Lizard Landscapes video. We've got a waterfall, more of a cascade slash cave. This is actually based on a real waterfall in Japan. If you do a search for this waterfall, there are really interesting pictures of the sun coming through at a certain time of day with a little bit of mist, a little bit of fog. So that is what actually attracted me to wanting to create this particular diorama. So yeah, do a search for that waterfall. There are shots that just look amazing that people have taken of the actual site, that is. So the way I did this as far as the fog is I'm in a really small room and I've got a can of fog that I've emptied out about a half of the can. And I'm just using my cell phone flashlight at the other end of it, pouring through that opening, obviously the light from the flashlight. So just an interesting way to enhance the photography of your dioramas, whether it be for if you're submitting it to a competition or if it's just for a website or just for your own documentation. Just a great way to get a more interesting look from your diorama. It's got a somewhat different way of creating a barrier for the resin to stop, creating a barrier instead of out of wood or plastic or something else. It's just part of the landscape is the barrier of the diorama, and it just kind of fades away into that arc of the rest of the lake. Spent quite a bit of time on creating those ripples. And so sit back and relax. This is a bit of an advanced tutorial. And let's go ahead and get started in creating this waterfall. So usually I start off with a sketch, a little basic sketch, and this is that little tiny sketch here. You want to make sure you are using a professional gas mask and that you are near an open window. So I'm using XPS styrofoam, the pink stuff, measuring out the base with a hot wire from the hot wire foam factory. And I'm going to go ahead and trace around that because I want a piece that is exactly the same dimensions. So I've got two exact same dimensions for that base. I'm going to hold these together for the time being with some pins and carved out a little bit of a hole, all the while, of course, looking at reference photos of this actual site. So the one on the right, obviously a little bit smaller, didn't quite know what scale to work in. So sometimes it's helpful to create a little portion of this in two different scales. So went with the larger scale on the left there and cutting out that sort of oblong oval shape that it wound up having. And so for the actual cascade, what I did was create kind of a basic stair step system. And so just creating basic stairs, and the idea being that I would then break away some of those steps in order for it to look more like a natural rock cascade. But yeah, in the beginning, it was like a really traditional kind of stair step. It's just a good way to start. So tracing around that hole in order to create a larger opening, because I want to protrude the cave, or extrude it. So yeah, creating another opening that is just a little bit wider than the original one, and then I'm going to start picking away at that extra piece. So if you look at the actual reference photos of this waterfall, it's not very deep as in the cave. It was a man-made cave, supposedly 300 years ago to, I guess, help farmers with irrigation. But so it's not very deep, but it does have a little bit of girth to it. So just using my fingernail, you can use it like a dull knife to create texture. I'm just trying to create texture and more rock face surrounding that opening of the cave. So gluing down some of this, all of the materials that I use will be in the description below. So figured out with that extra piece, I needed a little bit of an extension on the bottom, and then gluing that into place. Gluing a little small section on the right there. And I've got another kind of evening out that extrusion. And with every project I do, there's always some sort of weird gap that you can either fill with glue. This was a little bit too thick, so I just used another piece of styrofoam and went ahead and filled that in, tried to make it seamless. Other issues like this obvious seam, you can fix just using some of that glue that will be in the materials list in the description below. And it's thick enough that you can kind of carve it like clay and blend those two pieces together. So with the stairs, it became obvious that they were just super fragile, super thin. I think I broke one of them off at one point. So to strengthen these, I'm using just a watered down white glue, just giving it a good layer so that I don't end up breaking one of those off again. So tracing around the background, realized I needed a little piece to elevate the back of the stream so that it'll have the height in which to fall. So that's how the back of that is looking. And then drew out a little stream as in the source of that water. So the back of dioramas, this is something that I don't know, can bother you, but you just have to decide just how much detail you're going to put into the back of something if it's not really going to be shown. I put a little bit in there, but anyway, just taking a hot wire and gouging out just a little bit, not deep at all, for that back water section to flow out into the waterfall. So I've got some seafoam trees, and even though it's way early in the project, I've brought these out to try to figure out how much land I'm going to need to be able to fit these trees so that when I draw out where the water is, I'll still be able to fit these in there. So if you look at reference photos of this actual site, there's quite a bit of trees. There's actually very little of the rock that you're able to see. And then drawing out sort of a plan of how the landscape with the border is going to break away into revealing that water. So removing that main rock face and then taking flexible hot wire and just digging into that pond area. So speeding this up a little bit. So I didn't go any deeper than 1 inch. So the layer underneath, remember I haven't glued that down yet, was untouched, except for that little area where the water is exposed, where the border kind of breaks. So finally gluing that down, just going to put some weights on it to weight that down. So working on the slabs of rock, these are the kind of elongated slabs of rock that are right underneath the water line. So right underneath the surface of the water in the reference photos of this actual site, there's a whole bunch of long slabs of rock that I'm trying to emulate. So I've got an idea of where the surface of the water, so I'm trying to figure out and plan that these will be right underneath. So after a while, using all kinds of tools, one being a razor blade, fingernail, putting in a whole bunch of detail into these long slabs of rock here. And so worked on quite a few of these, got quite a few layers. So layers of rock underneath, some of the rock. I noticed quite a few layers in the photos. And using this technique I've used before, where you mark where these pieces are going to be, where you think they work best. So sometimes you can mix and match and then be able to figure out where you originally had them because you've marked them. Going ahead and gluing some of these rocks into place. And I worked quite a bit, put a little bit more time into this other side of the pond or lake with those rock formations. Got 3 layers of rock. And it's just done the same way as that other slab, where you're just kind of picking apart at it with various tools to create texture. So gluing in that main rock face, and then using some glue to try to help blend those 2 pieces together as if they're one cohesive piece. And then with the border, doing the exact same thing that I did with the rest of the project in order to create texture, just using my fingernail and other various tools. Really, just to summarize this, you're just creating a whole bunch of horizontal and vertical lines. Sometimes the lines are not perfect, might actually help for them to be, in this case, what you're looking at, some diagonal lines, just to kind of break up that look and make it look organic. So that's the back piece that elevates the water so that it kind of makes sense spatially as it falls. So mixing up some watered down acrylic black paint and just covering the entire thing in this stuff. Just getting into all of those cracks, and then after it's completely covered, we'll start a dry brushing technique. So mixing together a little bit of an earthy rock tone. Got some burnt orange and black, brown, a little bit of beige. Going to do a dry brushing technique where you remove quite a bit of the paint on anything, paper towel, something, and you're really just allowing the texture that you've applied to the foam to kind of pull off the paint at once. And then working in layers, got a little bit of gray here. Of course, looking at your photos and figuring out what type of earthy colors to use. And then putting in a whole bunch of lighter colors, and here applying like a clay color. So realizing you're going to cover up a good percentage of the layer you just applied gives it that kind of nice complex look. Also doing the exact same thing with the border, trying to create some contrast with some lights and darks right beside each other, trying to suggest that there are layers. And be sure and watch this intermission. All right, time for another intermission. This is where I go completely off topic and try to motivate those who haven't found God yet to start searching. All right, this video's topic is something no one, including some Christians, want to talk about. You rarely hear this in a Sunday church sermon, but of course it's in the Bible, and that is the doctrine of hell. The concept of there being 2 destinations you could find yourself in upon passing away and leaving this world. I think there's a misconception that fear is always a bad thing. And yet we can see its benefits occasionally in our lives. If we're out hiking and we hear a mountain lion growl, the fear can push you into action to take steps in order for you to protect yourself, whether it be running or reaching for something to defend yourself. Fear can be actually a great motivator. Luke 12:4 begins, "I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body and after that can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear the one who, after you have been killed, has authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." Now, it makes God sound harsh, but in that scripture, God is the just judge. just like a judge in a court of law can sentence someone to prison for the rest of their lives. Again, it sounds like God is being too harsh, but think of it in this way. When you were growing up, your parents did many things to help you. They had many responsibilities, one of which, and I realize how rough this sounds, but one of which was to prevent you from going to prison. Now, I also realize not all of us had great parents who were conscientious of this, but for the most part, parents knew in the back of their mind that if they didn't give you discipline and love and guidance and multiple warnings in many different forms over the years, and essentially give you some healthy fear of them, that you could wind up in prison someday. Now, what if a set of parents does all they can with what I've just mentioned, discipline, love, guidance, trying to encourage the right friendships, etc., and their child, an adult child at this point, still winds up in prison. While in prison, they go through torment and abuse, maybe from other inmates, guards, the warden, possibly self-torment. Is it the parents giving that torment? The parents aren't there anymore. You've been separated from them. The parents tried to prevent their child from going to prison. It's the others in prison with the adult child that are distributing any torment that they're experiencing. Prison is basically a quarantine for evil, so those in it don't affect or infect the rest of us. Hell is a quarantine for evil after you pass away, so those in it don't infect heaven. God is not in hell tormenting anyone. He's trying to prevent you from going to hell. It's interesting how he lets us see parallels to hell while we're here on earth, and in my opinion, prison is a great example. And some people ask, well, where does Jesus fit in? Why is he the only way? Jesus is the one who came into the courtroom, so to speak, and paid our fine. And some of you are like, what fine? All of the lies we've ever told, all of the things we've ever stolen, all of the other ungodly, unholy things we've ever said or done. In a court of law, when you lie under oath, or when it counts, you have to pay a debt to society. In God's word, he's essentially saying it counts all the time, not just when you're under oath. All those times no one was looking, all those debts have to be paid for. Your case before God, the just judge, can be legally done away with because of what Jesus did in paying our fine. In God's word, he is asking you to accept and believe in Jesus as having done this, and he's also asking you to let Jesus work through you in order for you to turn from sin. Now, sin, something the world accepts as normal and commonplace, but in reality will lead to a separation from God, just like someone is separated from their parents if they go to prison. So you can see the benefits of learning about hell and having a healthy fear of God, just like you had a healthy fear of your parents. That healthy fear can motivate you and help in saving your soul from eternal separation from God. The point of these videos is really to motivate you to do your own research and ultimately realize that this topic is worthy of your time. Check out all of the amazing testimonies online of people who have been to heaven and hell and whose lives have been transformed from following Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening. All right, so welcome back, and mixing together a little bit of aqua or teal color with like a light sandstone. So if you look at pictures of lakes where you can see rocks that are right below the surface of the water, usually they're blended. So they've got quite a bit of sandstone, but there's a little bit of algae, so there's a little bit of aqua, a little bit of teal blended into that color. And then the deeper you go into the lake or the water feature, in this case, the more prominent and darker of a color of green. So really good idea to look at your reference photos and just understand that color scheme and basically how nature works with the refraction of the water and the buildup of algae and how there is this blend. So I'm trying to incorporate like a sandstone color or whatever the color of your land is when you're doing this. In this case, I'm choosing like almost like a beach color. And then working with more of a prominent variation of green, ended up covering most of this up. That's just kind of how it goes. But and then, as I said, working more of darker as you go deeper into the water. So trying to suggest here, much deeper part of the lake or pond with this much darker green. And then a great way to blend these, because it always seems to look better if it's kind of a seamless blend, is to dry brush in between the layers. So you're using one particular color to dry brush on top of another one, and then vice versa, in order to hopefully create this seamless flow from towards the surface, more of a sandstone, and then blending down into more of a prominent green. So I've got a piece of like Tupperware, something like that, got it at a dollar store. And so I'm trying to figure out the barrier. Needed a certain type of plastic that was going to be strong enough, but not too strong, because I needed to be able to bend it, but it needed to essentially win the battle with the resin, because sometimes you can create a barrier whereby the resin will warp your barrier. So it's got to be strong enough to be able to stand up to that. So realized I needed to cut away some of the land barrier or border in order to be able to properly glue this barrier onto the feature, the lake feature. So just adding normal white glue, I'm going to glue this plastic down, putting it into place with some weights. That's how it's looking from above. Wanted that kind of natural curve that the rest of the project has. Also applying glue to the bottom, and there is a little bit of an opening in that bottom. So I've got a piece of plastic. You can get it like at off a supply store. Gluing that into place just so it seals. And then it's a process of trying to seal this so there are no leaks. So this is probably the project I had the most trouble with as far as leaks. I never actually got to the point where it did not have a leak. I just gave up and just started pouring the resin because I was just so frustrated with it. So you can see in the bottom part of your screen that leak developing. So a great way to make sure that you're guessing right on how much resin to mix is to pour all of that water into a wide mouth bowl and then pour that into a measuring device. And then it's a great way to guess how much resin to actually mix up for the project. So like I say, never really fixed the leak, although it got better. It was a really small, slow leak. So came up with the idea to mix up a very small batch of resin and just kind of roll it around in that reservoir, hoping that the resin being so much thicker than actual water would, as that small amount of resin would dry, would clog up that leak. And that did happen. So with this particular brand of resin, again, there will be a materials list in the description below. It's 1 part, 1 bottle to 2 parts of the other bottle, and I'm going to mix this up for 15 minutes. So I'm just going to pour a little bit out and then just kind of roll this around at this point, hoping that it finds where that leak is and stops it up. And pouring some resin into that back, very small feature where the water is actually coming from. Pouring the rest of that batch in there. So this is probably 24 hours later. Pouring in a second batch. I think there were 3 pours that I ended up doing. So this is after I've poured to the water line. So that's all that think it was roughly 16 ounces of resin. So I've waited about a week before removing these barriers. So using a razor blade, because I've literally glued these barriers to the diorama. Removing that bottom barrier and then realizing I need to remove some of the landscape border still to be able to remove that main barrier. So that one came off a lot easier than the bottom one. So with every pour of probably any resin, you get these kind of coagulated areas. You just need to remove those with a razor blade. Removing the back barrier for that small water feature that feeds the waterfall. So starting to apply the ripples. So this is a high gloss glue. Again, there will be a materials list in the description. And some people use an airbrush. That works fine. But I do think this particular method works really well, maybe even better, where you're just using a small brush to create little squiggly lines and progressing here. Looks ridiculous at first. Once it starts to dry, really starts to take on the look of moving water. So you've got the refraction of the light coming through and hitting those ripples. But I'm going to prop this up, propping this up to be able to see the glare of where that first layer of ripples are, because I want to apply a second layer. So it didn't quite look perfect, but I think 2 layers is a really good rule of thumb when it comes to this type of thing. You can kind of fill in the gaps, takes away any errors that just might not look right. So in removing that barrier for the back, sometimes you will end up damaging the project, just covering this up with paint and then dry brushing over that so it doesn't look so blocky. So gluing back those extensions of that land border. And I'm going to hold those in place overnight with some weights, make sure they dry right. And I'm going to go ahead and start painting the waterfall. Usually I create a separate piece out of plastic, but this is so small and it's just a cascade. Just decided to start painting directly onto the waterfall. So you can see on the right there, it's a really light gray, but pure white is on the left. So I've done an underpainting with the really light grays. If you look at pictures of waterfalls, it's not just the pure white foam. There's a lot of gray. There's quite a bit of negative space where you can see the rock underneath. And so going through here, putting on some pure white. So it's a process of going back and forth, using a small pin at this point. It's such a small scale that sometimes I will use a pin just dipped in white acrylic paint. Then using that pen to put in some negative space areas where there isn't white foamy water. And starting to dry brush the ripples right at the base. There should be some sort of white foamy movement in the water. So sometimes this shows up better than others. But you can also use a really tiny brush and just try to paint in your white foam that way. Of course, you can always use a pen dipped into white paint. And once you've got your resin set, you can go back and kind of reestablish the look of your landscape right before it hits that water. So putting back in sort of a nice rock sandstone color. With a pen dipped in white paint, you can kind of suggest a little bit of a water line, like the water is lapping up against that shore. And then with a clean pen, removing some of that just so that it's really subtle. So still refining the waterfall, making sure that I've only got white foam on the areas that are vertical. Every area that's horizontal, if you're looking at a cascade, it's going to be more of a clear water. It's really only going to be where it's falling. So all the areas where it's vertical, where you're going to get the white foam. Once that's dry, I'm going to try to reestablish this wet look because the white acrylic paint will leave behind a dull finish. And just going over that with the same stuff it took to create the ripples is just a high gloss glue to make sure the water looks wet. So using a tool, looks like a screwdriver, looks more like an ice pick, where I'm just kind of boring a hole into the landscape, and I'm going to insert some of these seafoam trees. Again, in the materials list below the video, I'll indicate, what all I'm using here. Just putting in some ground cover after applying some glue there, and just trying to figure out where all to put these seafoam trees. And sort of as a last stage here, applying some glue and then applying just a little bit of cotton, because even though this is really small, there would be a little bit of mist at the base of this waterfall. While that dries, using some model railroad foliage. This is just a great way to kind of add complexity to your diorama. You can fix problem areas with this. An area you don't know what to do with, like here. After applying that, it kind of looks like vines hanging down over your border there. And after that glue has dried from the cotton, just kind of teasing this up with some needle nose pliers and trying to make it look as if it's a little more active, like maybe some splashes are happening. So there you have it. Waterfall, more of a cascade, but cave with fog. Be sure to check out the other cave waterfall project with that one. It's totally different. The cave is actually underneath the waterfall with that one. It's on the channel. And of course, check out all of the other videos on the channel. Be sure to subscribe and like and comment. And as always, thanks for watching.